The Wasteland is a harsh, inhospitable hell, inhabited by mutated horrors and desperate men. An irradiated monument luring treasure hunters to their doom. But for a grizzled few, it's nothing more than an old world safe, just waiting to be cracked open. However, it was once planned to be more immersive and even more dangerous. This is the untold tale of the Mojave Wasteland. Prospectors are arguably the most interesting generic NPCs in New Vegas. They brave the wasteland, engaging whatever it has to offer, and assuming they live, scavenge the fallen. In the final game, they're relatively rare and only appear in a handful of locations. In fact, you're likely to run into more dead prospectors than living ones in a given run, but they were actually supposed to appear much more often and in many more areas. These numbers once represented their chance to randomly spawn, but in their script, area designer Jorge Salgado mentions that Oblivion-style chance spawns were no longer being used. Intrigued, I ask him about it. There were two reasons for which I opted to not use Oblivion-style chance spawns. One, the Fallout 3 engine didn't allow for it in the same way that the Elder Scrolls Oblivion did. Two, I wanted to have a more persistent and independent population of creatures for our New Vegas wasteland. In Oblivion, you could simply put a creature spawner object in the world, link it to a list of possible critters to draw from, more technically called a leveled list, and that's it. The engine would take care of spawning a set of creatures under the conditions of some parameters you could input, whenever a player approached the spawner game object. In Fallout 3 and Fallout New Vegas, that feature was disabled. Creatures couldn't dynamically be created out of the blue. Each spawner could only output one object, likely to address problems that many dynamically created actors could cause, especially in reckless hands. That turned out for the better because I saw it as an opportunity to create more complex behaviors in our creatures than simply appearing out of thin air and sitting there. As I already did in my mod for Oblivion, Oscuro's Oblivion Overhaul, I wanted to have a wildlife that would behave more realistically. Astute players would then be able to notice patterns. Geckos hunt insects, rad scorpions and giant ants don't get along. Night stalkers roam large swaths of the wasteland at night in search of lone preys to hunt as a pack, etc., and thus take advantage of these behaviors in their efforts to survive the wasteland. As part of a large performance pass, given the amount of memory consumed by nearby locations and creature variety, I had to trim down the composition and behaviors of these creatures considerably. It's still possible to see geckos hunting insects or night stalkers running into a gang of looters, but the breadth of the original design isn't in the original release anymore. I'm happy with how it turned out, all in all. I always wanted to have a wasteland whose creatures wouldn't simply level up/level down based on the strength of the player, which is another feature I had already worked into Oscuro's Oblivion Overhaul. And we designed FNV with that in mind. That said, the Oblivion system for spawning had some advantages I tried later to capture with a custom scripting system. While many players are aware of Prospectors, I'm not sure how many realize how interesting they actually are. So I asked Jorge to elaborate on his concept for Prospectors, as well as their cut content. One of my responsibilities in the development of FNV was designing and implementing encounters in the wasteland. I took this further than just placing creatures spawned out of leveled list. My goal was to bring life to the waste of New Vegas, and I opted for a handcrafted, and when necessary also scripted, approach. Out of this effect, I created and balanced most every creature found in the Wasteland outside of unique locations. E.g., I'd skip going into areas assigned to other area designers, such as Vault 34 or Camp Forlorn Hope, etc. And also made the Prospector system to balance a bit of the overwhelming presence of hostile critters while roaming around the waste. Prospectors were meant to act as independent, self-driven agents. They had a wide set of possible routes that would take them all over the Wasteland, even into interior locations at times. Given this behavior, it was inevitable that they would eventually be found near enemies. That's why they are, for the most part, able to fend for themselves and happy to dare into the dangerous lands outside of protected outposts. Prospectors were meant to remind players as they did their thing around the Wasteland, and would suddenly run into a friendly prospector having a firefight against looters or what have you, that the New Vegas world wasn't just scripted around them. In other words, my goal with Prospectors was to show that the game world was, to some extent, independent of the player, their level, their presence, etc. It's one of the things I try to infuse into my designs, a sense that the world is there whether you are in it or not, because emergent gameplay, aside from being interesting, tends to exponentially increase the sense of immersion a player experiences in a game world. We had to reduce the scope of the Prospector system a bit for performance reasons. There were a lot of factors that contributed to performance concerns, and we trimmed everywhere we could. So, the total number of prospectors roaming the Wasteland was reduced, and I also stripped some of their more problematic behaviors, like heading into many interiors, purposely attacking enemy hideouts and camps, dialogue options, etc. All in all, they came out rather unscathed, so I'm happy with the result. In conclusion, Jorge's vision was truly masterful. A wasteland more than just an area of enemies and radiation, but rather a living, breathing world filled with complex creatures and NPCs of varying factions, just waiting to create endless stories for the courier to experience. These additions would have gone a long way in immersing the player as they traveled across the wasteland. Ultimately, though, all of this was left on the cutting room floor.